We have been looking at some critical conversations last week and this week from the Gospel of John. Last week we looked at maybe one of the more familiar critical conversations that Jesus has with Nicodemus. But of course, at the end of that chapter, we also looked at a critical conversation that John the Baptist had with some of his disciples. So there are actually two critical conversations in John chapter 3. And we also saw John the Apostle's commentary on those conversations. We're continuing that today, though, from John chapter 4. What are critical conversations? I picked up that phrase because of it's used in different leadership contexts. A couple of years ago at the Global Leadership Summit, one of the talks that some business guru gave was about having critical conversations and the importance of critical conversations in your organization. So there's a couple books that have been written about that. I've not read these books, so I'm not putting these up here as if to imply I'm very knowledgeable about this. Okay, but I was using that phrase just because of listening to that talk a couple of years ago about the importance of critical conversation. And that was a hard topic for me because some people really get involved in those kind of conversations. I tend to run away from critical conversations. I don't like conflict too much. I prefer to avoid critical conversations. I like nice, smooth, non-dramatic conversations. But they're necessary, and there are some books that kind of help you navigate critical conversations that you might have to have, because generally all of you have to have some critical conversations. I just picked this up on the internet, just one way of thinking about what a critical conversation is. And number one, the stakes are high. So that's an English expression to say that a lot depends on this conversation. It's going to make a difference. That's why sometimes these conversations are necessary, because it's going to make a difference. Whether you have it or not will make a big difference in your organization. And then it's a critical conversation because the opinions are going to vary. Okay, it's not where you're all kind of on the same page, like your little Facebook friends or whatever, where you all agree with you. But you have different kinds of opinions, and this is important for a church like ours, where we necessarily must be very diverse. As an English-speaking church in Riga, we have to allow for a lot of differences of opinion, and we do. Okay, so opinions are going to vary, but also emotions are going to run very strong, which is why critical conversations are difficult, and why people like me, who might be a little bit afraid of emotions, would rather run from these critical conversations, because emotions are strong. When Jesus had his conversation with Nicodemus, the stakes were high. There was a lot depending on this conversation. I mean, Nicodemus' eternity, the nature of his life, depended on that conversation. And opinions would definitely vary. Jesus was challenging Nicodemus' opinion about some things, his way of looking at the world. And potentially emotions could run strong. In that conversation, you don't see strong emotions. Nicodemus maybe was a book kind of person, so he could keep his emotions in check. But underneath, there might have been strong emotions that Nicodemus was experiencing there. Anyway, we're talking about critical conversations. In the discussion that Jesus had with Nicodemus, one of the key phrases is that Nicodemus had to be born again. He had to change completely. And I was thinking about that this week because here's another image that one of my Facebook friends put up on Facebook. And I put it here because, a lot of people post up on Facebook that's just repost and repost. But she has gone through a significant lifestyle change. In fact, I wrote her and said, you need to write down your story. I mean, she lost her husband a number of years ago, and she's for long struggled with weight and those kind of health issues. And I don't know the story, but she didn't use pills and surgery. She has experienced a total lifestyle change. And you can just tell how she presents herself, even on Facebook, that it's like a new life she is experiencing. But like I said last week, Nicodemus probably understood he needed a few little things fixed in his life, and maybe Jesus was the right person to help him with this and that. But he didn't think he needed a lifestyle change. He didn't think he needed to be born again, being born from above, a new life. That's for other people. That's for those Gentiles maybe. Those sinning Jewish people somewhere else, but not Nicodemus. And Jesus made him very uncomfortable by telling him he needed a complete lifestyle change. So we're continuing that, talking about critical conversations. And today, in John chapter 4, it's a very different kind of person that Jesus is going to have a critical conversation with. Now, Nicodemus was a male. He was Orthodox, not in the sense of, Russian Orthodox or Greek Orthodox, but he was Orthodox in the sense of, he kept the law. He was a Pharisee. And so by the religious standards of his context, he was completely proper. He knew the law. He tried to obey the law. He fit in his context perfectly. He was educated. So Jesus said, "Are you the teacher?" He's apparently recognized as one of the leading teachers of his time. So he had a high degree of education for his context. And he was respected. Generally the Pharisees were very well respected. If he was also respected as a teacher, then that shows all the more how respected he was. And no doubt influential. Among other things, he was part of the ruling council. So he is one of the most important people in his society, at least in Jerusalem, very well known. And if he gave his credentials anywhere that he went, people would say, "Oh, okay, I understand how important you are." That was Nicodemus. The woman that Jesus talks to in John chapter 4 is going to be very, very different. Number one, she's female. Okay, she's a woman at the well, so of course she's female. But the fact that Jesus even engages her in a conversation is a little bit outside of the norm for his context. A little bit surprising that he might even engage in this conversation with this woman. She's a Samaritan, which is to say, racially, she is tainted. She's not pure blood Jewish. I'll in a moment kind of talk some about the history there, but in previous Israelite history, when people were taken off into exile, some people were left in the land and other foreigners moved in. There was intermarriage, and then people came back with mixed marriage wives. And so in the middle of the land of Israel, there's this area where a lot of the people were not pure blood Jews. She's a Samaritan, and their religion was a little bit different. They worshiped the same God, okay, but they didn't worship in Jerusalem. Okay, they didn't think of all of the law, all the Old Testament as their book, just the first 5 books. So she's a Samaritan, very different. She's unschooled. She's a despised moral outcast, and we'll see in a moment. Jesus in this conversation is going to bring out the fact that she's had 5 husbands. Now she's living with another guy who's not her husband. Okay, so in her context, again, she's likely to be looked down on by nearly everyone in her village. And without influence, or seemingly without influence. At least in comparison to Nicodemus's influence, she doesn't have that kind of influence. She probably wouldn't see herself as being a person of influence. People in her town, if you ask them, "Is this woman a person of influence?" they would probably say, no, of course not. We don't respect her. She doesn't determine how we live. She's not that important. So these are very, very different people. But of course, part of the point in the Gospel of John is that both of these people need Jesus equally. Both need Jesus equally. Nicodemus as much as the woman. Nicodemus as much as the woman. That's very hard for Nicodemus to accept that. Nicodemus, as much as the woman, need Jesus. They both need Jesus. And in making that final comment, I'm not just kind of spiritualizing something. It actually relates to what's going on in this section of the Gospel of John and in chapter 4. People's need for Jesus. Everyone's need for Jesus. Now, with that long introduction in mind, let's turn to John chapter 4. It says, the Pharisees heard that Jesus was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John the Baptist. Although, in fact, it wasn't Jesus who was doing the baptizing, his disciples. But when Jesus learned of this, that the religious leaders knew that Jesus was attracting a crowd, because he didn't want to draw too much attention yet, it says he left Judea and went once more to Galilee. Now, he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well, and it was about the 6th hour, probably 12 noon. Just very quickly, some of you are familiar with the geography here, but if you're not, this might help you. So Jesus has been down south, that's where he's been doing, that's where he had his conversation with Nicodemus, probably in Jerusalem. He's going to go back to his home area in Galilee in the north. And so in order to get there, he's got to pass through Samaria. Some Jewish people, to avoid this area, because these were tainted people, might actually cross the river, go up here and cross over. But the direct route is here. So Jesus is going back to his home area, and he stops here at this village of Sychar, and that's where this conversation is happening. And so they arrive there, Jesus and his disciples, around 12 noon. The disciples go into the village to buy some food, and there's Jesus sitting there, and this woman comes to the well to get water, and there Jesus is going to engage her in this critical conversation. So when the woman arrives, Jesus says, "Will you give me a drink?" And this surprises the woman. She says, "You're a Jew. I'm a Samaritan woman. Why are you asking me for a drink?" And John explains this by saying, "For the Jews do not associate with Samaritans." So normally this conversation, this critical conversation, would not happen. And so the woman is shocked that why is this Jewish guy actually asking me for a drink of water? Why would he want water that I would give him? Aren't I not tainted and despised in his eyes? Wouldn't my water be unclean to him? But Jesus asked. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink." That's going to be very critical. Who it is who's asking for a drink. It's going to be a discussion about water, but it's not about water mainly. It's about who is asking the question. It's about who is engaged in this critical conversation. So Jesus said, if you knew the gift, and especially if you knew who it is who's asking you for a drink, you would have asked him rather than he asking you. You would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. "Sir," the woman said, "you've got nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. How can you get this living water? You're not greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his flocks and his herds." So this well that they are sitting at is an ancient well, more than 1,000 years old. It goes back to Jacob, one of the patriarchs. That's why it's significant to the Samaritans, significant to this woman. Who are you who says you can offer me water? You can't be greater than Jacob. He's a patriarch. Who are you? Jesus answers her, "Everyone who drinks this water is going to be thirsty again. Whoever drinks the water I give him will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." There's water available that's going to come from inside and overflow to others. Jesus says that's possible. The woman is still thinking very literally here and doesn't quite get what Jesus is after. So the woman says, "Sir, give me this water so I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." I can't imagine what it would be like to every day have to draw your own water. I mean, what massive work that would be. I mean, could you imagine if you wanted a bath every day? You just wouldn't do it. Who would draw up from a well a bathtub full of water? I'd like to take a shower every day. If I had to draw the water up every day, I doubt I would do it. Imagine if none of us took a shower the last week. Isn't it good that we have running water? So she would be glad if she could somehow have water. She doesn't have to keep walking out to the well and draw this water. So she says, "Give me this water." Jesus seems to change the conversation. So it says, Jesus tells her, "Go call your husband and come back." Okay, like I said last week, Jesus in these conversations never makes people feel completely comfortable. They are life-giving conversations, but they're not necessarily comfortable. She has to reframe her thinking, and Jesus is beginning to retool her thinking. So he says, "Go call your husband and come back." "I don't have a husband," she replied. Jesus said, basically, no kidding. No kidding when you say you don't have a husband. The fact is, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you just said is quite true. So the woman says, "Sir, I can see you're a prophet." And it's hard to know what's going on here. Some people think that now this woman is so uncomfortable she's going to change the subject. Okay, and in a moment she's going to turn it to a religious discussion. So it might be she's just, "Whoa, I don't want to go down that road. Let's talk theology, because that's always safe. Better to talk politics than morality." So that might be why she says, "I perceive you're a prophet." Or it might be she does in fact realize there is something special about this guy. Maybe he can answer a critical question. And so she does in fact ask a critical question. "Sir," the woman says, "I can see you're a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain." I mean, the patriarchs did not worship in Jerusalem. It wasn't until David's time and Solomon's time that when a temple was built on Jerusalem that became a regular place of worship. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and those guys did not worship in Jerusalem. So she says, "Our father worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is Jerusalem. So what is it? If you're a prophet, do you have an answer to my question?" Jesus declares, "Believe me, woman, a time is coming when you're going to worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem." He's reframing her thinking, completely turning over the way she's processed and her people have processed life. "You Samaritans worship what you don't know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. But a time is coming and has now come. A time is coming and has now come." People have been longing for decades for a time to come. They were looking forward for a time. I mean, literally for hundreds of years. They're looking for a time when God was going to do something. And Jesus says, it's now come. The time has now come when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth. So the woman turns this discussion to a discussion about worship and what is the heart of worship. And at that time, a critical factor in worship is where you are going to worship. And there were kind of recognized, accepted places of worship because that's just where you did it. You had to have a place And it should be the same place. That's where you meet your God, because that's where God is. You meet God at a particular place. And you meet God often through particular rituals. Okay, and so for Samaritans, it wasn't in Jerusalem. And so they were made to feel second-class citizens because they didn't worship in Jerusalem. But Jesus essentially saying, forget about the place. It's not about the place. It's not about the forms. Something new is happening. Now, it's not that there's anything wrong with forms. Okay, everything that every Sunday morning we have a similar form here. We sing a few songs. Someone opens, sing a few songs. There's sometimes announcements, and there's a sermon. It doesn't have to be that way. It might change, but there's nothing wrong with forms. But Jesus is simply saying the place is not what's most important. The forms are not what's most important. What's most important is the person. It's all about you, Jesus. This is what Jesus is saying. It's secondarily about the persons who worship Jesus. They need to worship in spirit and truth. That is from the heart and from the mind. Okay, if one day robots can be programmed, to do all the things that we do in worship, will that be worship? I want to suggest not exactly what God is looking for. A robot one day, I imagine, will be programmed to do things. One day probably a robot can preach a sermon, can do the rituals, sacrifice animals, and distribute this and ring bells and do incense. Robots can do all those rituals probably. Will that be worship? No, what Jesus is looking for is a heart of worship, people worshiping in spirit and in truth, but especially people worshiping the right thing, namely Jesus. Not at a place or by forms, but having the right object of worship, which is Jesus. So the woman says, I know that Messiah is coming. When he comes, he'll explain everything to us. And this is how the discussion ends. Jesus says, I who am speaking to you am he. I'm the one you are looking for. It's me. I'm the one that you want. I am the focus, Jesus is saying. The living water is not mainly about the water itself or the nature of the water. It's about the one who gives it. It's about the water that Jesus gives. So again, forms have their place. Certainly there are some bad forms or wrong forms for worshiping God. And some forms are better than others. Okay, but the form of our worship is not the main thing. It's the person that we worship is what's most important. It's all about Jesus. Now, most of the time, when people look at John chapter 4, it's all about this discussion, this conversation that Jesus has with the woman at the well. Okay, and so for instance, that point about worship that I just made, I'm sure I've heard multiple sermons where that was the main point of the sermon, and it's a time to reflect on what is true worship. And of course, that would be completely legitimate to do that. It might be worthwhile, again, to talk about, what is true worship and what kind of worship does God desire. But the discussion with the woman is not actually the end of the story. And the discussion about worship is not the main point of the story, because there's another conversation and there's another conclusion or result or finale to this story that tells us what is the most important part of this story, because there's going to be another critical conversation that Jesus is going to have with his disciples now. I tried to see if I could actually find an image of Jesus talking to the disciples in this story, and you can't find it. You can find other pictures, like I found this, of Jesus with his disciples, but a picture of Jesus and his disciples around this well, I couldn't find that. Jesus and the woman, But the discussion that Jesus has with his disciples is often ignored here. But Jesus has a very important discussion with his disciples. Okay, so Jesus has this critical conversation with the woman, and she's going to go back to the town. Meanwhile, it says, just then his disciples returned, were surprised to find him talking with the woman. So that surprised the disciples, because again, Jesus the Jew shouldn't be talking to the Samaritan woman. That doesn't seem right. So they don't quite get Jesus yet. So they're a little bit surprised that he's talking to the woman. But here's one of the few times when they wisely kept their mouths shut. And John tells us that no one asked her or asked him, what are you doing? And no one asked her, why are you talking to her? No one actually asked those stupid questions, even though in their mind they're like, what's going on here? So the woman goes to the town and says to the people, come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Christ? So even though this woman was made to be uncomfortable in this conversation, Jesus is the light of the world. And the light exposed this woman and exposed her heart, and it exposed her lifestyle, and it no doubt made her uncomfortable. And yet the way with the conversation with Jesus is she is still drawn to him. She still recognizes there's grace in this man who showed the light on my sin. There's something there that maybe I still want. And so she goes to the town and tells the people, I met this guy. Maybe he's the Messiah. And so most of the town now is coming out to the well to meet this guy Jesus. Meanwhile, though, critical conversation number 2, Jesus and the disciples. So the disciples say, Rabbi, eat something, because they've gone into the town to get some food, and they brought it. They're probably thinking, wow, it'd be a little bit rude if we made the effort to buy this food. We brought our bags of McDonald's, and Jesus isn't going to eat it. So here's the food. Eat your food. But he says to them, I have food to eat that you don't know anything about. And as so often, the disciples are still thinking very, very literally. Jesus is talking about literal food, just like the woman at first thought he was talking about literal water. But it's just pointing to something else. So the disciples said, did someone else bring him food? Is there delivery here? Did the pizza deliver to the well? Where did he get this food? My food, said Jesus, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and finish his work. My food, my life, my energy, what keeps me going, Jesus says, is not that physical food, but it's to do the will of him who sent me and finish his work. Don't you say, 4 months more and then the harvest? I tell you, look up, open your eyes, look at the fields. I imagine very literally, Jesus means, look, turn your eyes, look at those people coming. The townspeople are coming to the well, and he's saying, look at them, look at those people. Forget about your bags of food. Look, pick your eyes up, look at all those people coming. Right there is the harvest. Right there is life. Right there is my life. Right there is my purpose. Right there is what gives me energy, what drives me, what keeps me going. Open your eyes and look at the fields. They're ripe for harvest. They're coming. They're literally coming. Now the disciples do need to think literally. They're literally coming. The harvest is coming. They're jumping in the basket. They don't even have to do the work, is what Jesus is saying to them. Even now the reaper draws his wages. Even now he harvests a crop for eternal life, so that the sower and the reaper may be glad together. What gives Jesus joy? This gives Jesus joy. These people coming Thus the saying, one sows, another reaps, is true. I sent you to reap what you have not worked for. Others have done the hard work, and you've reaped the benefits of their labor. Jesus says, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. This is where his life comes from. Where does life come from? Food and oxygen and water? Well, in a sense, but real life, true life, joyful life comes from this. In very mundane levels, you kind of know this is true. When you think about a marathon runner, or any kind of an athlete after the end of a long race or something where they're very, very tired, but you see it all the time. The guy who wins that marathon suddenly has this burst of energy. He's dead tired, and then suddenly the guy's making a couple extra laps around the thing. Because winning gives energy. It gives life. You think food does, but actually something in our spirit can give life, can give energy, can give joy. Even on a very mundane level, you see that happening where energy comes from succeeding in your mission. Just this morning, I found this. I don't know the context when Winston Churchill said this. Winston Churchill said a lot of things. Some of it pretty good. But in any way, he said, we make a living by what we get, but we make a life by what we give. We make a life by what we give. Our life isn't about our job. Our life isn't about the income that we get from that. Our life, our real life, is from what we give, what we do, how we contribute to what's going on in the world. The disciples have this amazing opportunity to join Jesus in what Jesus is doing. And in many ways, some others have done the hard work. Before these disciples, there were generations of prophets. And there was John the Baptist, and there was Jesus. And now these disciples just get to be a part of that process, to harvest what others have done. Others have done some of the hard work. And the disciples get the joy of bringing in the harvest. No doubt the joy of laying down some seeds that someone else is going to harvest. They get the joy of participating in God's work. And that's where their life is going to come from. Here's another critical conversation image that I just found, where a critical conversation will reframe or hope, give hope or power or challenge or demonstrate compassion. And I think we see all of these in this story happening. Jesus challenges the woman, and he challenges the disciples, and he leads them to reframe their thinking about where life comes from. They've got to come up with a different answer to that question. But he does this out of compassion. Out of compassion, he exposed the lifestyle of the woman, made her uncomfortable so that she could experience this living water. And with his disciples, out of compassion, he's brought them along. And he lets them see this crowd coming. And for the next couple days that we're going to see, they're going to get to be a part of some amazing things happening in this village. This is a gift of God to his disciples, that they get to be a part of what he is doing. And so he's giving them hope that their life can make a difference. And so he's empowering them. And again, that's the rest of the story of the New Testament, is these fairly weak guys being empowered to do amazing things through this critical conversation. So John tells us many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. When he said to her, he told me everything I ever did. So when the Samaritans came to him, they urged him to stay with them. And he stayed 2 days. And because of his words, many more believed. They said to the woman, we don't believe just because of your testimony. I mean, that was important. But now we don't even need your testimony anymore. Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know this man really is the Savior of the world. And that's the end of this story. Not just a conversation with the woman. The end of the story is the result. And the result is a bunch of Samaritans becoming followers of Jesus. Back when we were looking at Jesus' farewell discourse, one of the sermons was on making a difference. That one was from John 14. This is another story that's about that same thing, about making a difference. About the invitation to make a difference, about the possibility of making a difference. I said earlier on that this woman was a woman without influence, seemingly. No one in that village would have thought, oh yeah, this is a woman of influence. We listened to her. They listened to her. And they came to Jesus. She brought her village to Jesus. She became a woman of influence. This immoral woman became a woman of influence. It's possible. This compassionate conversation that Jesus had with this woman and exposed her heart to the light and poured living water into it so that living water could flow out of her. John chapter 7, Jesus talks about that, not just receiving living water, but living water flowing out. It was possible for this woman. And it was life-giving for her and for these disciples, that they could now, for the rest of their life, derive their life, their energy, their joy of participating in God's mission. This is a gracious invitation that God constantly gives us, that we can make a difference, whoever we are. There's always been people who've gone before us, who've actually made it possible. And there's people after us who need us to do our part. There's people after us who need us to plant some seeds. And maybe where you work, you're going to plant some seeds and you're not going to see the harvest. And it's okay. It's okay because someone else will. One day you'll know about that. And you can be joyful planting the seeds in confidence that this is God's work. And you're following Jesus in God's work. And the harvest will come at some point. I mean, one of the advantages of what I do here, coming to Latvia many, many years ago, and just having time to just kind of see the story. I mean, when I came in 1993, I was one of the early missionaries here, but before I came, there were some others who came. I mean, number one, there's already a church here in Latvia, even during Soviet times, that invited our mission to come here. And there's other people who came, and there's a previous international church that I was a part of that other people mainly did, and I got to be a part of it. I got to join that story. What's happening here, at least I could never have done this. Well, I could never do this. But 20 years ago, I'm dead certain that I wouldn't have been the person to be a part of this, what God is doing. I just got to join what others are doing. Okay? And I teach here at this Latvian Biblical Center. I didn't have anything to do with this place. I just get to be a part of it. This is God's gift to me. I get to join what others have done. Other people, I'm not an administrator. Many of you know that. Some of you know that there's other people in this church who are better administration. I'm administratively challenged. If the administration of this church depended on me, we probably wouldn't be here. I don't know where we'd be. Seriously. Other people have done that. I get to do what I do, which is mainly this. This is a gift to me. What I'm doing right now is not my gift to anyone. It's a gift to me. God lets me do this. He made me to do this. I don't have a lot of other skills. Believe me, I don't have a lot of other skills. And God has just given me the gift of letting me do this. This is life for me. Those who know me again know I struggle with anxiety and I'm stressed every Sunday morning. But I want to be here. I'm energized by being here. Okay? Because this is the way that God is giving me life. This is God's gift to me. And every single person, every single follower of Jesus can experience that. The woman could, the disciples could. You can make a difference. You can make a difference. In your home, at work, if that woman at the well could make a difference, you can make a difference. If she could bring a village to Jesus, you can draw someone toward Jesus. You can draw them toward Jesus. You might not be with them at the finish line. You can draw them toward Jesus. Even what happens here is going to bear fruit after Jesus ascends to heaven. When Philip goes to this area, there's going to be more harvest. Okay, there's more to come that even Jesus didn't do here. Jesus was putting down seeds and other people got to participate in it. And you get to have that role. You can make a difference. So this is what this story is mainly about. It's all culminating in these people coming to Jesus, this harvest for God's mission, and how everyone can participate in it. Whether normal Jewish males or immoral Samaritan women, they can participate in God's mission. That's our good news. Let's pray. Father, I pray that by your Spirit you would cause us to listen to your word as if it is a conversation with us personally. I pray that we could take Jesus' words personally as a message to us. That we would let Jesus, may we let Jesus expose our hearts. Shine your light in our hearts. Reframe our thinking. Show us, Jesus, where our thinking has been twisted or turned over or given to wrong priorities. Reframe our thinking. Focus our eyes on you, on your work. And may we draw our life from you and understand that you are life. And that we won't die by following you, that we will have real life by following you. I pray that we would hear that truth as if from your lips today. In Jesus' name, amen.